What if everything you learned about the first Americans is incomplete? What if the story is far older, far more complex, and far more remarkable than anyone imagined just a few decades ago? The truth is, we are still uncovering the beginning of this story. And with each discovery, the mystery deepens in the most beautiful way. For more than a century, we thought we knew. We had textbooks with clear timelines and simple explanations. The first people crossed a land bridge from Asia about 13,000 years ago. They walked through an ice-free corridor. They hunted mammoths. They were called the Clovis people, and they spread quickly across two empty continents. This was the story. This was what everyone believed. But the Earth has been keeping secrets. In coastal caves and river valleys, beneath ancient lake beds, and inside the molecules of our own bodies, evidence has been waiting. And when we finally learned to look in the right places, to ask better questions, everything changed. Tonight, we're going on a journey back to a time before nations, before cities, before agriculture. We are traveling to the very beginning of human presence in the Americas. This is a story that spans more than 15,000 years, maybe 20,000, possibly even longer. It is a story written in stone tools and ancient DNA, in oral traditions passed down through countless generations, and in the patient work of archaeologists who refuse to accept simple answers. If you drift off during this journey, that is exactly what this is for. Let the rhythm of this story carry you back through time. Whether you stay awake to hear every detail or fall asleep imagining those ancient footsteps, you will discover something profound about human resilience, curiosity, and the incredible journey that brought people to every corner of two vast continents. Some of what you will hear tonight is established fact, confirmed by multiple lines of evidence. Other parts are educated interpretations, scholarly debates still unfolding. We will be clear about the difference. We will acknowledge when experts disagree, when the evidence is incomplete, when we simply do not know yet. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of what makes this journey so compelling. We are living in a time when our understanding of the deep past is changing rapidly, when new techniques let us read stories written in mud and bone and stone. So settle in. Find a comfortable position. Let your breathing slow and deepen. We are about to step back into a world that no longer exists, to walk alongside people whose names we will never know, but whose legacy runs through every person living in the Americas today. This is their story. This is everyone's story. This is the tale of the first brave souls who looked at an unknown land and decided to keep walking forward into mystery. To understand the journey of the first Americans, you need to see the world as it was 20,000 years ago. Close your eyes and imagine a planet locked in the grip of the last ice age, a time geologists call the last glacial maximum. This is a world almost alien in its frozen vastness, yet it is the same Earth beneath your feet right now, just wearing a different face. Picture ice sheets so massive they beg your imagination. The Laurentide ice sheet covers almost all of Canada, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Rocky Mountains. It extends south into what is now the northern United States, reaching as far as modern-day Seattle, Minnesota, and New York. In some places, this ice is 2 miles thick, 2 miles of compacted snow and ice, so heavy it actually presses the Earth's crust down into the mantle below. Another enormous ice sheet, the Cordilleran, clings to the western mountains, covering the peaks and valleys in white. Together, these two ice masses hold so much of the world's water locked in frozen form that the oceans sit more than 300 feet lower than they do today. 300 feet. That is roughly the height of a 30-story building. This lower sea level changes everything about the world's geography. Coastlines extend miles, sometimes hundreds of miles, beyond where they are today. The English Channel is dry land. You could walk from France to England. The islands of Southeast Asia are connected to the mainland. And in the far north, between Asia and North America, a vast plain of tundra emerges from the sea. This is Beringia. We will return to Beringia soon, because it is central to our story. But first, you need to understand what life was like in this Ice Age world. The climate was not uniformly frozen everywhere. Yes, the high latitudes were brutally cold, dominated by the ice sheets. But further south, the world was cooler and drier than today, not completely frozen. The American Southwest, now desert, was dotted with lakes and more vegetation. Giant Ice Age mammals roamed across grasslands and forests unlike any ecosystem we have today. Think about the animals of this time. Woolly mammoths with their curved tusks and shaggy coats, standing 11 feet tall at the shoulder. Mastodons, slightly smaller but just as imposing, browsing in spruce forests. Giant ground sloths as tall as modern elephants, moving slowly through ancient landscapes. Saber-toothed cats with those distinctive elongated canines. Ambush predators of extraordinary power. Short-faced bears, possibly the largest land predators to ever exist, capable of running down prey across open ground. There were giant beavers the size of modern black bears. There were dire wolves, larger and more robust than the gray wolves we know today. There were glyptodonts, which looked like armadillos the size of small cars, covered in thick armored shells. There were American camels and horses, both of which evolved in the Americas before spreading to Asia and then going extinct in their homeland. This was the Pleistocene megafauna, and they dominated the landscape in a way that is hard for us to imagine now. Our world has elephants and rhinoceros and bears, but the sheer number and variety of massive animals 20,000 years ago was something different entirely. Into this world, humans were about to arrive, or perhaps they were already there. This is where our story truly begins, and where the certainty of older textbooks gives way to something more interesting. Genuine scientific investigation filled with surprises. The traditional story said humans were in Siberia, living in small groups, surviving the Ice Age through incredible resourcefulness. They made sophisticated tools. They hunted large animals. They sewed fitted clothing from animal skins. They built shelters, partly underground for insulation against the terrible cold. These were not primitive people. They were highly skilled, deeply knowledgeable about their environment, capable of thriving in conditions that would kill most modern humans within hours. And then, the story went, around 13,000 years ago, they crossed into Alaska and moved south. But here's where it gets interesting. Recent evidence suggests people might have been in the Americas much earlier, perhaps 15,000 years ago, perhaps 17,000. Some controversial sites suggest dates even older than that, though these remain debated. What was happening during those thousands of years, when the ice sheets dominated the north? Were people waiting in Beringia, that land bridge between continents? Were they living there for generations, adapting to that unique environment before pushing further east into Alaska? Or did some groups find ways to move along the coast, traveling by boat, reaching the Americas while the interior was still locked in ice? These questions drive modern archaeology. Every new discovery has the potential to rewrite the timeline. And the beautiful thing is, researchers welcome this. Science is not about defending old ideas. It is about following the evidence wherever it leads, even when it surprises us. Let your mind rest in that Ice Age world for a moment. Imagine the silence of vast spaces, broken by the calls of animals we will never see. Imagine the peculiar light of long Arctic days in summer, the absolute darkness of winter. Imagine small bands of humans huddled around fires, telling stories, planning their next hunt, caring for children, looking at the horizon and wondering what lay beyond. The world was about to change in ways they could not imagine. The ice was beginning its long retreat. New lands were opening up, and the stage was set for one of the most remarkable migrations in human history. Beringia was not a bridge. This is the first thing to understand. When we say land bridge, we picture something narrow, a temporary connection between two places. But Beringia was a world unto itself, a subcontinent that existed between Asia and North America for thousands of years. At its greatest extent, Beringia stretched more than 1,000 miles from north to south. It was as wide as Alaska and as varied in its landscape. There were rivers and streams. There were areas of tundra covered in grasses, sedges, and small shrubs. There were valleys where larger plants could grow, sheltered from the harshest winds. This was not just a pathway. This was a homeland. The Bering Strait as we know it today, that narrow passage of water between Russia and Alaska, was dry land. The Chukchi Peninsula and the Seward Peninsula were parts of the same continuous landscape. You could walk from Siberia to Alaska without ever seeing the ocean. In fact, if you were standing in the middle of Beringia 20,000 years ago, the ocean would have been so far away in all directions that you might live your entire life without ever glimpsing salt water. What was it like to live there? Recent research has given us a surprisingly detailed picture. Beringia was cold, certainly, but it was not the frozen wasteland we once imagined. It was what ecologists call a mammoth steppe ecosystem, dominated by grasslands that could support large herds of grazing animals. Woolly mammoths moved across Beringia in numbers we can barely conceive. Some estimates suggest there might have been millions of them across the entire mammoth steppe that stretched from Spain to Canada. These were not solitary animals. They lived in herds, like modern elephants, with complex social structures. The matriarch, the oldest female, led the group. She remembered where water could be found in summer, where the grazing was best, where to shelter from winter storms. Horses ran across the Beringian plains in herds as well. These were not the large horses we know today, but stockier animals adapted to the cold. Bison were there too, and caribou, and musk oxen with their long shaggy coats and curved horns. Predators followed the herds. Wolves, lions, bears, all drawn to the abundance of prey. And humans were there. We know this now with certainty. People lived in Beringia, not just passing through, but actually living there, possibly for thousands of years. This is one of the major changes in our understanding. Beringia was not just a corridor people rushed through to get to the Americas. It was a place where human populations lived, adapted to the environment, developed their own culture and traditions. Think about what this means. Imagine generations of people who knew only Beringia. Children born there who grew up hunting mammoths and gathering plants, who never knew the lands their great-great-grandparents came from in Siberia. These Beringians were distinct, genetically and culturally, from both the Siberian populations to the west and the later populations that would spread through the Americas. How do we know this? The answer comes from multiple sources. Genetic studies of modern Native American populations and ancient DNA from archaeological sites reveal a period of separation, a time when the ancestors of Native Americans were isolated from other Asian populations. This fits perfectly with the idea of people living in Beringia for an extended period. Archaeological evidence, though rare because much of Beringia is now underwater, supports this as well. The few sites we have found in eastern Beringia, the part that is now Alaska, show sustained human presence going back at least 15,000 years, possibly longer. But life in Beringia was not easy. The winters were long and dark and brutally cold. Summer was brief, though during that short season, the land would have come alive with activity. Migratory birds would arrive in enormous numbers, nesting in the tundra. Mosquitoes and other insects would emerge in clouds. The plants would grow quickly, taking advantage of the nearly constant summer daylight this far north. The grazers would feed intensively, building up fat reserves for the coming winter. Human life followed the rhythms of the seasons. In summer, there was work to do. Hunting, fishing, gathering plants, preparing skins, making and repairing tools. Everything had to be done while the weather allowed. In winter, life contracted. People stayed in their shelters as much as possible, venturing out only when necessary to hunt or to gather frozen meat they had cached earlier. They had sophisticated technology. They made tools from stone, bone, and ivory. They knew how to work mammoth ivory, carving it into implements and possibly art objects, though few of these have survived. They made needles from bone, tiny and precisely shaped, with eyes for thread made from animal sinew. With these needles, they could sew fitted clothing, essential for surviving the cold. Their clothing would have been remarkable. Multiple layers of animal skins, carefully prepared and sewn together. Pants and jackets, boots and mittens, all designed to trap heat, while still allowing enough flexibility for movement. Failure in clothing meant death. So the knowledge of how to prepare skins, how to sew them, how to maintain them, was literally survival knowledge. They understood fire intimately. In Beringia, fuel was scarce. Trees were rare or non-existent in many areas. They burned bone, which is a slow-burning fuel. They burned mammoth dung, dried in the summer and stored for winter. They burned any wood they could find, carefully rationing it. Every fire was precious. Letting a fire go out could mean death if you could not relight it. And they had knowledge that went beyond technology. They knew the behavior of animals, which plants were edible, how to read the weather, how to navigate across featureless landscapes. They had stories and songs, spiritual beliefs, social structures. They were fully human in every sense, living complete lives in that vanished land. Here is what is remarkable. These people, living in Beringia, were poised to become the ancestors of everyone who would eventually inhabit two continents. Everyone, from the Arctic Circle to Tierra del Fuego at the southern tip of South America, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific Islands. Every Native American population traces its ancestry back through these Beringians. But they did not know this. They were not planning a great migration. They were simply living, season after season, generation after generation. And then, slowly, things began to change. The climate started to warm. The ice sheets began to retreat. New passages opened up. And at some point, some groups decided to move east or south, or along the coast. They were not conquering a new world. They were not on an expedition. They were following game, seeking new resources, exploring, perhaps fleeing conflicts, perhaps just satisfying human curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. The journey from Beringia into the Americas was beginning, and it would change everything. But that journey, as we are learning, was far more complex than anyone imagined. For most of the 20th century, there was only one accepted path for the first Americans. They came through the middle of the continent, walking south between two massive ice sheets. This was called the ice-free corridor, and it seemed to make perfect sense. The Laurentide ice sheet on the east, the Cordilleran ice sheet on the west, and between them, a narrow passage from Alaska down through what is now Alberta and into the Great Plains of the United States. The timing seemed to fit. Around 13,000 years ago, as the climate warmed, these two ice sheets separated. A corridor opened up, perhaps 500 miles long, and varying in width from perhaps 10 to 50 miles. The oldest archaeological sites in the Americas, the Clovis sites we will discuss later, dated to just after this corridor opened. People came through, the theory said, and spread rapidly across the continents. It was a clean story. It was teachable. It was in every textbook. And then the evidence started to not quite fit. First came the dating problems. Sites in South America started showing dates that were just as old as, or even older than, the Clovis sites in North America. How could people reach southern Chile at the same time they first appeared in New Mexico if they were coming from the north? The math did not work. People would have had to travel impossibly fast. Then researchers started looking more carefully at what that ice-free corridor was actually like when it first opened. What they found was troubling for the old theory. Yes, a gap between the ice sheets appeared around 13,000 years ago, but it was not immediately habitable. It was a wasteland of rock and mud and glacial meltwater. There was no vegetation at first, which meant no animals, which meant nothing for humans to eat. It might have taken centuries for that corridor to become a viable route for human migration. So if people could not have come through the interior, at least not at first, where did they come from? The answer that is gaining acceptance is both simple and profound. They came along the coast. Picture the Pacific coast 20,000 years ago, 15,000 years ago. The sea level is hundreds of feet lower than today. The shoreline extends far beyond where it is now. What is now underwater continental shelf was exposed as dry land, creating a wider coastal plain. And crucially, while the interior of the continent was locked under ice, parts of the coast were ice-free. This was not obvious at first. When scientists looked at the modern coast, they saw glaciers coming right down to the ocean in many places, especially in British Columbia and Alaska. How could people have traveled along a coast that was covered in ice? But then researchers started using new techniques to figure out exactly when and where the ice had been. They studied the shapes of underwater features. They dated rocks that had been scoured by glaciers. They built detailed computer models of ice sheet growth and retreat. And they discovered something surprising. Even during the last glacial maximum, there were ice-free areas along parts of the coast. Small refuges, places where the ice did not reach, where plants and animals could survive. These refuges would have been like islands in a sea of ice. And humans, if they were there, could have moved from one refuge to another, perhaps by boat. This is where the story gets really interesting. The traditional picture of the first Americans was of people on foot, following game across land. But what if they were also maritime people? What if they had boats and knew how to use them? This seems radical at first, But it makes sense when you think about it. Humans reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, which required crossing significant stretches of open ocean. If people could do that, why not use boats along the Pacific coast? The resources would have been abundant. Seals, sea lions, fish, shellfish, seabirds, kelp forests teeming with life. For people who knew how to exploit coastal resources, this route would not have been a desperate journey. It would have been a rich pathway. The problem with proving this theory is that most of the evidence is now underwater. When the sea level rose at the end of the Ice Age, it flooded the coastal route. Any campsites, any harbors, any evidence of human presence along that ancient coast now sits under hundreds of feet of water. Underwater archaeology is difficult and expensive, and we have barely begun to explore those submerged landscapes. But we have found some tantalizing clues. On islands along the British Columbia coast and southeast Alaska, archaeologists have discovered ancient sites that show human presence dating back 13,000 years, possibly older. These islands would have been coastal hills on the exposed shelf during the Ice Age. People were there, and they were using coastal resources. Stone tools found at these sites show no clear connection to Clovis technology, suggesting a different tradition. In South America, the Monteverde site in Chile has been firmly dated to at least 14,500 years ago, possibly older. This is 1,000 years before Clovis, and Monteverde shows a people who used coastal and forest resources, not primarily big game hunters. They ate seaweed. They used a variety of plants. They built structures from wood and hide. This looks nothing like what we once thought the first Americans should look like. On California's Channel Islands, there is evidence of human presence going back at least 13,000 years. These islands were further from the mainland during the Ice Age due to the lower sea level, but they were still islands. People must have used boats to reach them, and once there, they exploited marine resources so intensively that they developed specialized tools and techniques that persisted for thousands of years. All of this points to the same conclusion. The first people to reach the Americas probably did not come as a single wave through the center of the continent. They came along the coast, probably in multiple waves over thousands of years, using boats, living on marine resources, slowly exploring southward along the Pacific shore. It is a completely different picture from the old model. It is messier, more complex, harder to pin down with exact dates and routes, but it fits the evidence better, and it honors the sophistication of the ancient people involved. They were not just foot travelers following mammoths. They were maritime people, as comfortable on the water as on land, with the knowledge and technology to thrive in coastal environments. Can you imagine it? Small boats, maybe made from wooden frames covered with hide, like the kayaks and umiaks later used by Arctic peoples, or perhaps dugout canoes, carved from massive trees that grew near the coast. A family or an extended kin group, paddling south along an unfamiliar shore, camping on beaches, fishing in kelp forests, harvesting shellfish, watching the coastline for signs of good places to stop. Sometimes they would find a particularly rich area and stay for a season, or several seasons, or even generations. Other times they would keep moving, driven by curiosity or by population pressure or by the simple human urge to see what is over the next horizon. Their journey might have taken centuries or millennia, with each generation moving just a little further along the coast. And then some groups would leave the coast, moving inland along river valleys, finding different resources, adapting to new environments. The great diversification of Native American peoples was beginning, as different groups split off and moved into different ecological niches across two continents. This coastal route theory is still being investigated, still being debated. We will probably never know every detail, but it has fundamentally changed how we think about the peopling of the Americas. The first Americans were not frozen wanderers desperately seeking refuge. They were skilled mariners and coastal dwellers, following a route that was, for them, not a hardship, but a pathway through abundance. Sometimes the most profound archaeological discoveries are also the most simple. Not grand temples or golden artifacts, but footprints pressed into mud 23,000 years ago, preserved by chance and discovered by careful scientists who knew what they were looking at. In White Sands National Park in New Mexico, researchers found something extraordinary. Hundreds of human footprints, made during the late Ice Age, ranging in date from approximately 23,000 years ago to about 21,000 years ago. Let that settle in your mind for a moment. 23,000 years ago, more than 10,000 years before the Clovis people, who were supposed to be the first Americans. These are not ambiguous stone tools that might be naturally fractured rocks. These are not controversial dating samples that might be contaminated. These are footprints, unmistakably human, made by adults and children and possibly teenagers, walking across mudflats near an ancient lake that no longer exists. And the dating is solid, based on radiocarbon dates from seeds of aquatic plants that grew in the same layers of sediment as the footprints. Picture this scene. The sun is bright overhead, reflecting off the shallow waters of the lake. The mud is soft beneath bare feet, squelching between the toes. An adult walks steadily, purposefully. Behind, a smaller set of prints. A child, perhaps 8 or 10 years old, following. Sometimes the child's prints are right on top of the adult's, as if walking in the same tracks. What were they doing? Walking from one place to another, certainly. Going to fish in the lake, perhaps, or to gather plants along the shore. Just living their lives, going about daily tasks, completely unaware that their footsteps would be preserved for scientists to find more than 20,000 years later. There are prints of other animals too, captured in the same ancient mud. Giant ground sloths, mammoths, dire wolves, camels. In some places, the human footprints and the animal tracks cross each other. You can see where a mammoth walked across a place where humans had walked earlier, or where humans came after the mammoth. These prints tell stories of a landscape teeming with life, where humans and megafauna shared the same spaces. One set of tracks is particularly poignant. Small prints, probably a young child or a teenager, moving in a straight line in one direction. Then, in another layer of mud laid down some time later, the same individual's prints, now returning along nearly the same path, but carrying something heavy. The prints are deeper, more uneven, suggesting a burden, perhaps carrying meat from a hunt, or water in containers, or firewood. A simple errand, repeated countless times in that person's life, and now we can see the evidence of it. These white sands footprints have forced a major rethinking of the timeline. If people were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they must have been in the Americas much earlier than that, because New Mexico is far from either the ice-free corridor or the coastal route. These were not the first people to arrive. They were descendants of people who had been exploring and settling the continent for potentially thousands of years before. This raises profound questions. Where are the earlier sites? Why have we not found more evidence of these early populations? The answer probably has to do with visibility. Archaeological sites are hard to find under the best circumstances. Sites from the late Ice Age are particularly hard to find because the landscape has changed so much. Rivers have shifted course. Forests have grown where there were once grasslands. The sea has risen, flooding coastal areas. Many early sites are probably underwater now, or buried under meters of sediment, or destroyed by erosion. The white sands footprints survived only because of a specific set of circumstances. The mud dried quickly in the arid climate. More sediment, probably windblown, covered the dried mud, protecting it. The lake eventually dried up completely. Thousands of years passed. Then erosion, probably from wind, gradually removed the protective layers and exposed the footprints again, just long enough for scientists to find them before they eroded away completely. Think about how much luck is required for preservation like that. Now think about all the places where people walked where the conditions were not quite right for preservation. All the footprints that were washed away by rain before they could dry. All the camps that were built on river terraces that later flooded and scoured away. All the artifacts that degraded, returning to the earth. For every site we find, how many have been lost? Hundreds? Thousands? This is why archaeologists are cautious about making claims about the first anything. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as the saying goes. Just because we have not found earlier sites does not mean they do not exist. It might just mean we have not looked in the right place yet, or we do not have the tools to recognize what we are seeing, or the sites are simply gone. But the white sands footprints do something important. They prove that people adapted to a wide range of environments very early. These were not just coastal people. They were also living in the interior, in arid regions, exploiting different resources. The diversification of human populations across the Americas had already begun. Imagine the knowledge these people needed. Living in the Southwest during the Ice Age was different from living on the coast. Different plants, different animals, different water sources, different weather patterns. They needed to know which plants were edible, which were medicinal, which were poisonous. They needed to know where to find water in a semi-arid landscape. They needed to know how to hunt the animals of that region, how to track them, how to process the meat and skins. This knowledge did not come instantly. It was built up over generations through observation and experimentation, and sometimes painful mistakes. And it was transmitted through teaching, through stories, through children watching adults and learning by example. This is culture in its most fundamental form. This is how humans survive in new environments. We learn, and we share what we learn, and we build on the knowledge of those who came before. The people who left their footprints at White Sands were not pioneers in the sense of being the first. They were the inheritors of knowledge from previous generations who had already adapted to this land. They knew where they were going. They knew what to do when they got there. This was their home, and had been for their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. Sometimes when you look at prehistoric archaeology, it is easy to feel a sense of distance, to think of ancient people as fundamentally different from us. But footprints bridge that distance in a profound way. These were feet like yours, toes that got cold, soles that got sore from walking on rough ground, arches that sometimes ached at the end of a long day. These were people who felt heat and cold, hunger and satisfaction, fear and joy. They loved their children. They mourned their dead. They laughed and told jokes and had arguments and made up. And they walked across the mud on a sunny day by a lake that no longer exists, going about the ordinary business of living, never imagining that thousands of years later, someone would find those footprints and try to piece together their story. For more than 50 years, the Clovis people were the answer to every question about the first Americans. Who were the first people here? The Clovis people. When did they arrive? About 13,000 years ago. How did we know? Because Clovis sites were found all across North America, and nothing had been convincingly dated to earlier than Clovis. Case closed. Except, of course, it was not that simple. It never is. But before we talk about how the Clovis first theory fell apart, we should understand what Clovis was and why it was so compelling. In 1929, archaeologists working near Clovis, New Mexico, found something remarkable. Stone spear points, beautifully made, found among the bones of extinct bison. More importantly, the spear points and the bones were in geological layers that dated to the end of the Ice Age. This was the first solid proof that humans had been in North America during the Pleistocene, living alongside extinct megafauna. More sites were found. Throughout the 1930s and 40s and 50s, similar spear points turned up across North America, from the East Coast to the West Coast, from Canada to Mexico. They all had the same distinctive style. Long, fluted points, meaning they had channels or flutes running partway up each face. These flutes were created by removing long, thin flakes from each side of the point. It was a sophisticated technique, difficult to execute, and it resulted in a point that was relatively lightweight but strong, ideal for tipping spears. The uniformity of Clovis points suggested a single culture spread across the continent. And since no earlier culture had been found, the conclusion seemed obvious. These were the first Americans, and they spread rapidly from north to south, their distinctive technology marking their passage. It was an elegant theory. It fit the ice-free corridor model. Around 13,000 years ago, the corridor opened. People came through. They brought their Clovis technology with them, and they spread quickly across a landscape that was, from a human perspective, essentially empty and rich with game. Some researchers even proposed that the Clovis people hunted the megafauna to extinction within just a few centuries, a theory called Pleistocene overkill. But cracks in the theory began to appear. First, the timing did not quite work with the ice-free corridor. As we discussed earlier, that corridor would not have been immediately habitable when it first opened. Second, sites in South America were showing dates as old as or older than Clovis. Third, and most problematic, some sites in North America started producing dates that seemed to predate Clovis. These pre-Clovis claims were highly controversial. For decades, the archaeological establishment resisted them. The evidence was scrutinized intensely, sometimes perhaps too intensely, with a skepticism that bordered on rejection. This was not necessarily bad science. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence for pre-Clovis occupation was often ambiguous. Dating techniques had problems. Sites were complex and difficult to interpret. Researchers had to be careful not to mistake natural rocks for stone tools, or to accept contaminated radiocarbon dates. But gradually, the evidence accumulated. Monte Verde in Chile, the site we mentioned earlier, was finally accepted as genuinely pre-Clovis after years of debate. Other sites followed. The Paisley Caves in Oregon produced ancient human DNA and artifacts clearly dated to before Clovis. The Buttermilk Creek site in Texas showed stone tools in layers older than any Clovis occupation. And of course, the White Sands footprints, discovered much later, pushed the timeline back by thousands of years. Today, Clovis first is no longer the dominant theory. We now know that Clovis was not the first. But this does not make Clovis unimportant. Far from it. Clovis remains one of the most fascinating archaeological cultures in the Americas, and understanding it helps us understand something profound about human adaptation and innovation. So what was Clovis? The best current interpretation is that Clovis was a technological and cultural phenomenon that emerged in North America, probably somewhere in the central or southern plains, around 13,000 years ago. The distinctive fluted points were an innovation, a new and highly effective way of making projectile points. And this innovation spread rapidly. Why did it spread? Probably because it worked. A well-made Clovis point, hafted onto a wooden shaft, made an effective spear for hunting large game. The fluting reduced the overall weight of the point while maintaining strength, and it may have helped with hafting, creating a socket that could grip the shaft securely. The technology was impressive enough that groups who encountered it adopted it. But Clovis was not just about stone points. The sites we have found suggest a mobile lifestyle, with groups ranging over large territories, following game, exploiting seasonal resources. They were sophisticated hunters, certainly, capable of bringing down mammoths and mastodons when the opportunity arose. But they were also generalists, eating a wide variety of foods including smaller game, fish, and plants. Clovis sites often include tools made from bone and ivory as well as stone. They had scrapers for preparing hides, knives, hammerstones for making other tools. They transported high-quality stone over long distances, sometimes hundreds of miles, suggesting either extensive travel or trade networks. Some Clovis sites have produced materials from sources so far away that direct procurement seems unlikely. People were moving materials, and probably ideas, across vast distances. One of the most interesting aspects of Clovis is its sudden appearance and rapid spread. Within just a few centuries, Clovis points appear across almost all of North America. How did this happen? The most likely explanation is that this was a cultural spread, not a population spread. The people were already there, descendants of earlier populations, but they adopted the Clovis technology because it was useful. Imagine a highly effective new tool, design being shared from group to group through meetings, through intermarriage, through observation and imitation. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, Clovis disappeared. By around 12,800 years ago, people stopped making classic Clovis points. New styles emerged, more regional, more diverse. The archaeological record becomes more complex, with different cultural traditions developing in different areas. What happened? We are not entirely sure. The timing coincides with major environmental changes. The last of the megafauna were going extinct. The climate was changing rapidly as the Ice Age ended. Lakes were drying up in some areas. New forests were growing in others. The world the Clovis people knew was transforming. It is possible that the generalized, mobile, big-game hunting lifestyle associated with Clovis was no longer optimal as the environment changed. People needed to adapt to more diverse, more localized resources. The cultural uniformity of Clovis gave way to regional diversity as different groups adapted to their specific environments in their own ways. Or perhaps Clovis was never as uniform as we once thought. Maybe we were seeing pattern where there was actually more variation. As archaeologists find more sites, and use more sophisticated analysis techniques, the picture becomes more nuanced. Clovis might have been one cultural tradition among many, just the most visible one to us, because fluted points preserve well and are easy to recognize. Here is what we can say with confidence. Around 13,000 years ago, a distinctive stone tool technology emerged in North America and spread widely. The people who made and used these tools were skilled hunters and foragers, mobile groups who ranged across diverse landscapes. They were not the first people in the Americas, but they were successful, and their technology persisted for several centuries before evolving into new forms. And in every Clovis point that survives, we see evidence of human ingenuity. Someone figured out how to strike a stone in just the right way to remove a long flute without shattering the entire point. They figured out the right angles, the right force, the right technique. Then they taught that technique to others. This is how culture works. This is how human knowledge accumulates and spreads. Let your mind rest on that image for a moment. A person sitting in the evening light, carefully examining a piece of stone, visualizing the finished point within the raw material, then striking with precision and skill, the flake flying off, the point taking shape. Hours of work for a single projectile point. And when it was finished, it was not just a tool. It was a work of craft, a demonstration of skill, a link in a chain of knowledge passed down through generations. The Clovis people, whoever they were, whatever their full story might be, left us these beautiful objects as evidence of their presence. And every time archaeologists find a Clovis point, they are touching something that last saw sunlight 13,000 years ago, something made by hands that were human like yours, with skills honed through practice, with knowledge shared and learned, with lives lived in a world that no longer exists but can still be glimpsed through patient study. Science progresses not by people defending old ideas, but by carefully examining new evidence and being willing to change their minds when the evidence demands it. The story of pre-Clovis archaeology is a story of resistance and eventual acceptance, of patience and persistence, of how genuine scientific discoveries eventually prevailed despite initial skepticism. For decades, anyone who claimed to have found evidence of human presence in the Americas before Clovis faced an uphill battle. The burden of proof was high, perhaps too high, because Clovis first had become not just a theory, but almost a dogma. Careers were damaged by association with controversial pre-Clovis sites. Papers were rejected. Grants were denied. The scientific establishment can be conservative, and in some ways that is good because it prevents acceptance of poor evidence. But it can also slow the recognition of genuine discoveries. Let's talk about Tom Dillehay and Monteverde, because this story illustrates the challenges researchers faced. In the 1970s, Dillehay began excavating a site near a creek in southern Chile. What he found was extraordinary: a buried surface containing wooden structures, stone tools, plant remains, and other evidence of human occupation. The preservation was remarkable because the site had been covered by a peat bog shortly after it was abandoned, creating anaerobic conditions that preserved organic materials that normally would have decayed. The radiocarbon dates were startling. Around 14,500 years ago, over 1,000 years before Clovis. If the dates were right, if the site was genuinely what it appeared to be, it completely undermined Clovis first. People could not have reached southern Chile before they reached North America, after all. Dillehay knew he would face skepticism, so he documented everything meticulously. He brought in specialists to analyze every aspect of the site. Botanists studied the plant remains. Geologists examined the stratigraphy. Multiple labs ran radiocarbon dates on different materials. He published detailed reports, sharing his data openly. But the skepticism was intense. Some archaeologists questioned the dating. Others questioned whether the stone tools were really tools or just naturally fractured rocks. Some suggested contamination, redeposition, misinterpretation. Site visits were arranged where skeptical archaeologists could examine the evidence firsthand. Debates continued for years. Eventually, by the late 1990s, the majority of the archaeological community accepted Monteverde as genuinely pre-Clovis. The evidence was simply too strong to dismiss. But it took more than 20 years from the initial excavation to general acceptance. That is how difficult it was to challenge the Clovis first paradigm. And once Monteverde was accepted, Other sites gained new credibility. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania had been producing dates older than Clovis since the 1970s, but had been largely dismissed. Now researchers looked at it again with fresh eyes. The Paisley Caves in Oregon, with their ancient human DNA preserved in coprolites, dried fecal material, provided hard evidence of human presence over 14,000 years ago. The Buttermilk Creek site in Texas, the Deborah L. Friedkin site, showed clear evidence of a stone tool industry that predated Clovis. Site after site has now added to the picture. People were in the Americas before Clovis, probably well before. And as we saw with the White Sands footprints, potentially much earlier than anyone expected even a few years ago. What is emerging now is a more complex, more interesting story than the clean narrative of Clovis first. Instead of a single migration through a single route at a single time, we are seeing evidence of multiple waves of migration, possibly over thousands of years, using different routes, bringing different technologies, adapting to different environments. Think about what this means. The Americas were not settled in a single rapid expansion. Instead, populations grew gradually, spreading and diversifying over millennia. Different groups developed different cultures, different technologies, different ways of life adapted to their specific environments. By the time we see the Clovis phenomenon, there was already considerable diversity across the continents. This is actually a more realistic picture. Humans are adaptable. We do not all solve problems the same way. Even with similar challenges, different groups develop different solutions based on their specific circumstances, their available resources, their cultural traditions, and sometimes just chance variations that happen to work and so persist. The pre-Clovis people were using different stone tool technologies than Clovis. Some of these technologies look more like earlier Asian traditions, which makes sense if people were coming from Asia. But some seem to be new developments that arose in the Americas. People were innovating, experimenting, finding what worked in their particular circumstances. At Monte Verde, for example, the stone tools are relatively simple. There are no fancy fluted points. But the people there were using a wide range of materials. They had wooden tools, including what might be mortars and grinding stones for processing plants. They were using medicinal plants, as indicated by botanical remains found at the site. They built structures using wooden posts and possibly hide coverings. They created a site that was clearly a camp where people lived for some period of time, processing food, making tools, living their lives. This looks different from the mobile, big-game hunting lifestyle we associate with Clovis. These were people adapted to a coastal and forest environment, exploiting a broad range of resources, not specialized mammoth hunters. And this makes sense if they came via the coastal route, where marine and coastal resources were abundant. In North America, the pre-Clovis evidence is more fragmentary, which might be expected given that these sites are older and have had more time to be destroyed or buried. But what we have suggests similar diversity. Some sites show bifacial tools, points made by flaking both faces of a stone. Others show more emphasis on flake tools, where people struck flakes off cores and used those flakes with minimal further modification. Some sites have evidence of bone tool use. The technologies varied, suggesting different traditions, different populations, or different adaptive strategies. One of the challenges with pre-Clovis sites is that many of them do not have the well-preserved, clearly human-modified artifacts that make Clovis so recognizable. Clovis points are distinctive. Even a non-archaeologist can look at a Clovis point and recognize it as something made by humans. But earlier technologies were often simpler, or at least less diagnostic. A stone flake with some edge, where it could have been made by humans, but it could also be a natural fracture. This ambiguity is why some early sites remain controversial. But the totality of the evidence is now overwhelming. People were in the Americas before Clovis. They were probably here thousands of years before Clovis. They came from Asia, probably via multiple routes, probably in multiple waves. They brought different technologies and different cultural traditions. They adapted to diverse environments from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America. They were the ancestors of the rich tapestry of Native American cultures that existed when Europeans arrived. This new understanding does not diminish the Clovis people. It contextualizes them. Clovis was one successful adaptation among many. Its technology spread widely because it worked well for certain purposes in certain environments at a certain time. But it was not the beginning. It was a chapter in a much longer, much more complex story. And that story is still being written. Every year brings new discoveries. Archaeological techniques continue to improve. We can now extract and analyze ancient DNA from tiny fragments of bone or even from sediments. We can date materials with increasing precision. We can model past climates and environments with sophisticated computer simulations. We can use LiDAR to see through forest canopies and find archaeological sites that were previously invisible. Each of these advances opens new possibilities for discovery. Somewhere out there, right now, there are archaeological sites waiting to be found that will push our understanding even further. There are answers buried in the earth, or submerged on the continental shelves, or hidden in places we have not thought to look yet. The story of the first Americans is far from complete, and that is part of what makes it so fascinating. For now, though, let yourself settle into the understanding that the past is deeper and richer than we once knew. The Americas have been home to humans for at least 15,000 years, probably longer, perhaps much longer. And in all that time, human ingenuity, adaptability, and resilience have been constant themes. Let's step away from the big questions of dates and migrations for a while and think about something more immediate. What was it actually like to live in ancient America? What did people do each day? How did they spend their time? What were their concerns, their pleasures, their routines? Imagine waking at dawn in a shelter made of wooden poles, covered with animal hides. The fire in the center of the space has burned down to coals during the night, but it is still warm enough to provide a little heat. Outside, the sky is lightening, and you can hear birds beginning their morning songs. There is frost on the ground. Your breath makes clouds in the cold air. This is late autumn, perhaps 12,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now the central United States. You are part of a small group, maybe 20 or 30 people, all related to each other through blood or marriage. These are the people you have known your entire life. They are your family, your community, your entire social world. The first task of the morning is to tend the fire. Fire is life. It provides warmth, light, protection from predators, and a way to cook food. Letting the fire go out would be a serious problem, so someone is always responsible for making sure it stays alive. You add dry wood carefully, blowing on the coals until small flames appear. Once the fire is going well, you can add larger pieces of wood. Water is needed. There is a stream about 100 yards from camp, and several people go to fetch water in containers made from sewn hide or perhaps woven baskets sealed with pine pitch. The water is clear and cold, fresh from recent rain. While you are at the stream, you might notice tracks in the mud. Deer have been here during the night. This information is noted mentally, something to tell the hunters. Back at camp, people are beginning the day's activities. Some of the men are checking their spears and odlottles, the spear-throwing tools that increase the range and power of a thrown spear. Hunting is planned for today. The deer tracks by the stream confirm what people have been noticing for several days. The deer are moving through this area on their fall migration, and this is a good opportunity to get meat. But hunting is not simple. It requires knowledge, skill, patience, and often a bit of luck. The hunters talk quietly among themselves, planning their approach. They know where the deer are likely to go based on years of experience in this landscape. They know which valleys the deer prefer, where the game trails lead, where water and good grazing can be found. They will move upwind of the deer, approaching quietly, staying out of sight until they are close enough for a good throw. While the hunters prepare, others in the camp have their own work. Several women are processing hides from a previous hunt. The hides have been staked out on the ground, and now the fat and tissue on the inner surface need to be scraped off. This is hard work, requiring strong arms and sharp stone scrapers. But it is also social time. The women talk as they work, sharing news, telling stories, keeping an eye on the younger children who play nearby. Children in ancient times learned by watching and doing. There were no schools, no formal lessons. A child watched their parents and elders, and gradually began to help with age-appropriate tasks. A young child might help gather firewood, picking up small sticks while adults carried larger pieces. An older child might help with hide processing, learning the techniques through practice. Teenagers would begin to participate more fully in adult activities. Young men joining hunts under the guidance of experienced hunters. Young women learning the detailed knowledge required for plant gathering and processing. Education in a hunter-gatherer society was constant and comprehensive. By the time someone reached adulthood, they had absorbed an enormous amount of knowledge. They knew which plants were edible and when they were ready to harvest. They knew how to track animals, how to read signs in the landscape, how to predict weather, how to find water, how to make tools, how to prepare and store food, how to treat injuries and illnesses, how to make shelter and clothing. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in people's minds and hands, passed from generation to generation through demonstration and practice. The plant knowledge alone was extraordinary. There were hundreds of plant species in any given region, and people knew which parts of which plants could be eaten, which were medicinal, which were poisonous, which were useful for technology. Roots, seeds, leaves, berries, nuts, bark. Some plants required processing to be edible. Some were only good at certain times of year. Some grew in particular habitats. All of this information was carried in memory, a living library of botanical knowledge. By mid-morning, the hunters have left camp. They will be gone for hours, possibly all day. In camp, other activities continue. Someone is making cordage, twisting plant fibers together to create strong string or rope. This cordage has countless uses. It can be used to tie things together, to make nets for fishing or catching birds, to create snares for small game, to attach points to spear shafts, to bind structural elements of shelters together. Others are working on stone tools. Making good stone tools requires skill and knowledge. Not every kind of rock is suitable. The best materials are fine-grained stones like flint, chert, or obsidian, which fracture in predictable ways. The process of flaking stone, called knapping, involves striking the core stone with a hammerstone or using pressure from a pointed tool to remove flakes. Each strike must be carefully controlled. Too hard, and the piece might shatter. Too soft, and nothing happens. The angle matters. The point of impact matters. It takes years of practice to become truly proficient. And yet, stone tools were made constantly. They dulled with use and needed to be resharpened or replaced. A day's work might use up several cutting tools, so there was always stone working happening. The sound of stone on stone ringing through the camp, sharp flakes scattering on the ground. These flakes themselves were useful. Fresh flakes have extremely sharp edges, sharper than most steel knives. They could be used for cutting, for scraping, for any task that required a sharp edge. Midday brings a light meal. Perhaps some dried meat from a previous hunt, some nuts gathered earlier in the fall, some dried berries, water to drink. The meal is simple but sufficient. In a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, people do not always eat at fixed times. You eat when you are hungry and when food is available. Sometimes it means several small meals throughout the day. Sometimes it means one larger meal in the evening. Sometimes, during periods of scarcity, it means going hungry. But this is autumn, a time of relative abundance in many regions. The summer's growth is mature. Nuts are falling from trees. Animals are fat, having fed all summer. The hunting has been good recently. Food is not an immediate concern right now, though everyone knows that winter is coming. And winter can be hard. Part of the daily work at this time of year is preparing for the lean months ahead, drying meat, gathering and storing nuts and seeds, making sure there is enough firewood cached near camp, repairing clothing and shelters. All of this is done with an eye toward future needs. In the afternoon, the hunters return. They have killed a deer, a mature doe, and they carry it into camp on a pole slung between two men's shoulders. There is satisfaction in the camp. Meat means rich food for several days. It also means work. The deer must be butchered, the meat cut into pieces, some of it cooked fresh, some of it cut into strips and dried over fire to preserve it. The hide must be carefully skinned off, preserved for later processing into leather. The sinew, the tough tendons, will be saved for sewing and binding. The bones will be cracked to extract the marrow, rich in fat and nutrients. Nothing is wasted. The evening meal is a social time. Fresh venison roasts over the fire, fat dripping into the flames, the smell making everyone's mouth water. People gather around the fire as the sun sets and the air grows cold. They eat and talk, sharing news of the day. Someone tells a story, an old story known to everyone but still enjoyed in the telling. Children sit close to adults, soaking up the warmth of the fire and the companionship. As darkness falls completely, the stars come out. In an era with no artificial light, the night sky is spectacular. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a river of light. People know the stars. They use them for navigation, for keeping track of seasons, and they have stories about them. Constellations are not just patterns. They are characters in narratives, lessons encoded in the sky. Eventually, people retreat to their shelters to sleep. The fire is banked, covered with ash to help it stay alive through the night. Someone will wake periodically to add wood, ensuring the fire does not go out. And in the shelter, wrapped in furs and hides, surrounded by family, people sleep the deep sleep of physical exhaustion earned through a day of useful work. This is a single day, simplified and generalized. Every day was different in specifics, but the rhythms were consistent. Work, rest, meals, sleep. Social time, solitary tasks, cooperative efforts. Teaching, learning, practicing. The cycle of seasons brought its own rhythms. Spring with its plant growth and animal births. Summer with its warmth and abundance. Fall with its harvest and preparation. Winter with its cold and reliance on stored food and careful management of resources. Life was not easy. Injuries happened. Illnesses occurred. People died, sometimes young. Childbirth was dangerous. Food shortages could happen. Conflicts with other groups were possible. But life also had its satisfactions. The pleasure of a successful hunt. The taste of fresh food. The warmth of a fire on a cold night. The laughter of children. The companionship of people you trusted completely. The knowledge that you were skilled at what you did. The stories and songs that bound the community together. These ancient people were not living a diminished existence, waiting for civilization to rescue them. They were living complete human lives, with all the complexity and richness that entails. They had material culture, social structures, belief systems, art, music, stories. They had knowledge systems as sophisticated in their way as any modern science, perfectly adapted to their needs. They had relationships, emotions, thoughts, dreams. And they had satisfaction in their skills. Think about the person who could nap a perfect stone point, or tan a hide to perfect softness, or know exactly where to find a particular plant at a particular time of year, or read tracks in the mud and tell you exactly what animal passed and when. These were real accomplishments, requiring intelligence, memory, practice, and skill. So when you think about ancient Americans, do not picture a grim struggle for survival. Picture people living full lives, working, playing, loving, arguing, teaching, learning, enjoying moments of beauty and pleasure, coping with hardships, telling jokes, making art, wondering about the nature of the world, being human in all the ways humans have always been human. Imagine looking across a grassy plain and seeing a herd of mammoths in the distance. Enormous shaggy forms moving slowly, their curved tusks catching the light. The sound of their low rumbling calls carries across the landscape. You have seen mammoths before. Everyone in your group has. But they never stop being impressive. An adult mammoth might weigh 6 tons, stand 11 feet tall at the shoulder, and have tusks that curve and sweep in elegant arcs, sometimes over 10 feet long. This was reality for the first Americans. They shared the landscape with an array of massive animals that seem almost mythological to us now. But to them, these animals were simply part of the world, like deer or rabbits are to us. Dangerous, yes. Useful, absolutely. But also familiar, understood through generations of observation and experience. The Pleistocene megafauna of the Americas was spectacular. We have mentioned some of them already, but let's really picture them. Mammoths, of course, the most famous, but also mastodons, which were similar but stockier, with straighter tusks and a preference for browsing in forests rather than grazing on grasslands. Both mammoths and mastodons were relatives of modern elephants, part of the same family, and their behavior was probably similar in many ways. They were social animals, living in herds led by matriarchs. They were intelligent, with large brains and complex behaviors. They cared for their young for years. They possibly mourned their dead. Giant ground sloths were unlike anything alive today. The largest species, Megatherium, could reach 20 feet in length when standing upright and might have weighed 4 tons. They were herbivores, but their massive claws and enormous size meant they were not particularly vulnerable to predators. Imagine seeing one of these creatures standing upright to reach vegetation in a tree, its bulk swaying gently as it stripped leaves with its long tongue. The short-faced bear, Arctidus, was possibly the largest land predator to have evolved. Some estimates put the largest males at over a ton in weight, standing 12 feet tall when upright. Unlike modern bears, which are often omnivorous, short-faced bears seem to have been primarily carnivorous. With their long legs, they were capable of running down prey across open ground. A human encountering one of these bears would have been in serious danger. Saber-toothed cats, properly called Smilodon, were ambush predators built for taking down large prey. Those famous elongated canines, sometimes 8 inches long, were actually quite fragile and had to be used carefully. The cats would ambush prey, probably going for a killing bite to the throat or belly, using those sabers like daggers. They were heavily muscled in the front quarters, built for grappling and wrestling prey to the ground. American lions were larger than modern African lions. Dire wolves were bigger and more robust than gray wolves. There were species of giant camels, giant beavers, ancient horses, enormous bison with horn spans of over 6 feet. There were giant armadillos, peccaries, tapirs. The sheer diversity and size of these animals is hard to comprehend if you are used to modern North American fauna. How did humans relate to these animals? The evidence suggests a complex relationship, varying by species and probably by region and culture. Some megafauna were clearly hunted. We have found mammoth kill sites where stone tools are mixed with mammoth bones, showing clear evidence of butchery. We have found spear points among the ribs of mastodons and bison. Humans were capable of killing these large animals, though it surely required skill, cooperation, and courage. But hunting megafauna was probably not an everyday occurrence. These were dangerous animals, and a hunt could go wrong in terrible ways. A mammoth could easily kill a human with its tusks or by simply stepping on someone. A short-faced bear was not something you wanted to encounter unexpectedly. Even herbivores like giant ground sloths could be dangerous if threatened. Their claws were formidable weapons. More likely, large game hunting was opportunistic and selective. When conditions were right, when a good opportunity presented itself, when the group had enough skilled hunters available, then yes, they might attempt to take down a mammoth or a mastodon. The payoff was substantial. A single mammoth could provide thousands of pounds of meat, enough to feed a group for weeks. The hide, bones, and ivory were all useful. A successful hunt was a major event. But day to day, people probably relied more on smaller game, fish, and plants. Rabbits, birds, fish, nuts, roots, berries. These were more predictable, less dangerous to acquire, and could be gathered by more members of the group, including children and elderly people. Megafauna hunting might have been important culturally and nutritionally, but it probably was not the main subsistence strategy most of the time. There is something else to consider. Some researchers believe that the relationship between humans and megafauna might not have been purely predator and prey. Modern hunter-gatherers often have complex beliefs about animals, seeing them as kin, as beings with their own agency and power, as worthy of respect. It is possible, maybe even likely, that ancient Americans had similar beliefs. Imagine sitting around a fire and hearing stories about the great mammoth, told as tales where the mammoth is a character with personality and power. Perhaps there were rituals before a hunt, asking permission from the spirits of the animals, promising to use the meat and materials respectfully. Perhaps there were taboos about certain animals, rules about how they could be hunted or when. We have no direct evidence of these beliefs, but they are common enough in later Native American cultures and in hunter-gatherer societies worldwide that it seems reasonable to assume something similar existed. Then, starting around 13,000 years ago, the megafauna began to disappear. Over the next few thousand years, more than 30 genera of large mammals went extinct in the Americas. The mammoths, the mastodons, the giant sloths, the saber-toothed cats, the short-faced bears, the giant beavers, the American lions, the horses, the camels. All gone. Why? This question has generated intense debate for decades. Two main theories have been proposed, and both probably played a role. The first theory is human overkill. The idea is that when humans arrived in the Americas, they found populations of large animals that had no experience with human hunters and no appropriate fear response. The animals were naive, easy to hunt, and humans exploited them intensively. Some models suggest that even relatively low levels of hunting pressure, just a few animals killed per year by each band of humans, could drive populations to extinction over centuries, especially if humans preferentially hunted females and young. This theory is controversial and emotionally charged. Some people resist it because it seems to blame indigenous peoples for environmental destruction. But that is not a fair interpretation. If the overkill hypothesis is correct, it does not mean ancient Americans were somehow bad or careless. It means they were effective hunters doing what humans have always done, exploiting available resources, and the consequences were not immediately apparent. By the time megafauna populations began declining noticeably, many generations had passed. No individual or group would have recognized that their hunting was contributing to extinction. The process would have been too slow and too spread out to be visible at a human scale. The second theory emphasizes climate change. The end of the Ice Age brought rapid and dramatic environmental changes. Temperature shifted. Precipitation patterns changed. Entire ecosystems transformed. The mammoth steppe, that unique grassland ecosystem that supported mammoths and other grazers, was shrinking and changing. As the climate warmed, forests expanded into areas that had been grassland. For animals adapted to cold, open environments, this was catastrophic. Their habitat was disappearing. Most scientists now think both factors played a role. Climate change stressed megafauna populations, making them more vulnerable. Human hunting added additional pressure. Together, these factors drove species to extinction. It was not one thing or the other, but the combination. What was it like to live through this change? Remember, it happened over centuries and millennia. For any individual human, it would have been barely noticeable. Your grandparents might tell you that when they were young, mammoths were more common, but you still saw mammoths occasionally. Then your grandchildren might say that they only saw a mammoth once, when they were young. And then, eventually, there's stories about mammoths, but no living person has seen one. The landscape changed too. The great herds thinned and vanished. Predators that depended on megafauna had less food and declined as well. The extinction of one species affected others in cascading ways. Eventually, the world reached something close to what existed when Europeans arrived in the Americas thousands of years later. Large animals still existed, deer and elk and bison, but not the incredible diversity and size of the Pleistocene megafauna. Did people mourn the loss? Did they notice? Did they wonder what happened to the great animals of their grandparents' stories? We cannot know, but it seems likely that some knowledge, some memory, persisted. Some Native American oral traditions mention large animals that no longer exist. Whether these are actual memories passed down through countless generations, or later stories inspired by discoveries of fossils, is debated. But the possibility that some memory of the megafauna survived in human culture is profound. For now, let yourself imagine that encounter one more time. You are on a plain at sunrise, and in the distance, a mammoth is silhouetted against the lightning sky. It tears at grass with its trunk, methodical and calm. You watch from a safe distance, awed by its size and grace. This is not your prey today. This is simply another being sharing the world with you. Ancient and powerful, part of the rich tapestry of life. And though you cannot know it, you are among the last few thousand generations of humans who will ever see such a creature alive. Let's talk about something concrete. Technology. The tools and techniques that allowed humans to not just survive but thrive in the Americas. When we think about ancient people, it is easy to focus on what they did not have. No metal tools, no writing, no wheels, no cities, no domesticated animals except dogs. But this focuses on absence. Let's talk about presence instead. Let's talk about what they did have, what they created, what they knew. Start with stone. Stone tools are what archaeologists find most often because stone survives. Pottery breaks, but the sherds persist. Bone decays but can survive in the right conditions. Wood, hide, fiber, all the organic materials. These usually disappear completely. But stone endures. A stone tool made 15,000 years ago looks almost the same today as when it was made. It might have some weathering, some discoloration, but the essential form remains. Making good stone tools requires knowledge that goes far beyond simply hitting one rock with another. First, you need to know which stones are suitable. Not all rocks fracture in predictable ways. What you want are fine-grained stones with what is called conchoidal fracture. This means they break in smooth curves, like glass. Flint, chert, jasper, obsidian, chalcedony. These are the preferred materials. Each has slightly different properties, different colors, different availability. A skilled napper can look at a piece of raw stone and visualize the tool within it, the way a sculptor might look at a block of marble. They can see where to strike, what angle to use, how the force will propagate through the stone, where the fracture lines will run. This knowledge comes from years of practice, from making countless tools, from learning to read the subtle variations in the stone. There are different techniques for different purposes. For making large tools like hand axes or spear points, you might use what is called percussion flaking. This involves striking the stone with a hammerstone, a hard piece of rock used as a hammer. Each strike removes a flake, gradually shaping the stone into the desired form. The skill is in controlling the strikes. Too hard, and you might break the piece entirely. Too soft, and the flake does not detach. The angle matters. The placement matters. Expert nappers can remove flakes with precision, taking off exactly what they want and leaving the rest intact. For finer work, like the final shaping of a point or the sharpening of an edge, you might use pressure flaking. This involves using a pointed tool, maybe made from bone or antler, and pressing firmly against the edge of the stone to pop off tiny flakes. This gives much more control than percussion flaking and allows for very detailed work. The fluted Clovis points we discussed earlier required pressure flaking to create those distinctive channels. And then there is heat treatment. Many stones can be improved by heating them carefully. The heat changes the crystal structure slightly, making the stone flake more predictably. But this is tricky. Heat the stone too quickly, and it might crack. Heat it too much, and it might be ruined. Heat it just right, though, and you get a material that is easier to work with and produces sharper edges. This was sophisticated materials science, developed through experiment and careful observation. Once a tool is made, it needs to be hafted, attached to a handle. A stone knife blade is much more useful if you can hold it without cutting your hand. A spear point needs to be securely attached to a shaft. This is where other materials come in. Sinew, that tough connective tissue from animals, can be wrapped around a joint while wet. As it dries, it shrinks and grips tightly. Pine pitch or other tree resins can be melted and used as glue. Sometimes a combination of methods is used, sinew wrapping plus pitch, plus a carved notch or socket to hold everything in place. The otlotl, the spear thrower we mentioned earlier, deserves special attention. This is a simple tool in concept but profound in effect. It is basically an arm extension, a stick with a hook or socket at one end that holds the butt of a spear. You hold the otlotl in your hand, the spear resting along it, and then you throw using the same motion you would use for throwing a spear by hand. But the otlotl gives you leverage, effectively increasing the length of your arm and the power and velocity of your throw. An otlotl can double or even triple the effective range of a spear compared to throwing by hand. It also increases the force of impact. This means you can hunt from further away, improving your safety margin. You can penetrate hide and bone more effectively. The otlotl was a revolutionary piece of technology, used across the Americas and in other parts of the world. Some researchers think its invention was as important for human hunting as the bow and arrow later became. Speaking of the bow and arrow, this technology appears in the Americas relatively late, probably not until around 2,000 to 3,000 years ago in some regions, later in others. Before that, the otlotl was the primary projectile weapon. Once the bow was invented or introduced, though, it spread rapidly because it offered advantages. Faster rate of shooting, easier to use in confined spaces like forests, more accurate at short range. But the otlotl remained in use in many places, sometimes alongside the bow. Now let's think about other technologies. Fiber working, for example. The ability to process plant fibers and animal materials into cordage, baskets, nets, and textiles was essential. Cordage, string or rope, was needed for countless tasks. Making a good string from plant fibers involves harvesting the right plants at the right time, processing them to separate the fibers, and then twisting the fibers together. The twisting is done in a specific way so that the tension holds the cord together. It is simple in principle, but requires practice to do well. With good cordage, you can make nets for fishing or catching birds. You can weave baskets tight enough to hold water if you coat them with pine pitch. You can create snares for trapping small game. You can make bags for carrying gathered foods. You can tie bundles together for transport. Cordage was technology that multiplied the effectiveness of human hands. Fire technology was absolutely fundamental. We often take fire for granted when discussing ancient peoples, but creating and maintaining fire required deep knowledge. Different methods existed for making fire. The bow drill method, where you spin a wooden spindle rapidly in a notch in a fire board, using friction to create heat, and an ember. The hand drill, similar but without the bow. Fire plow, striking stones to create sparks. Each method requires dry materials, the right woods, proper technique, and patience. But making fire is only part of the challenge. Maintaining it is equally important. A group that let its fire go out faced a serious problem. Making fire from scratch is difficult and time-consuming. Much better to keep the fire alive, banking it at night with ash, adding wood carefully throughout the day, protecting it from rain. Many groups probably carried fire with them when they moved camp, perhaps in the form of a slow-burning coal wrapped in leaves or bark, transported carefully, and used to start the fire at the new location. Fire gave so much. Warmth, obviously, essential for surviving cold climates. Light, extending the usable day into evening hours. Protection, since most predators fear fire. The ability to cook food, which makes many foods more digestible and safer to eat. Kills parasites, breaks down toxins. The ability to cure meat by smoking, preserving it for later use. The ability to heat treat stones for better tool making. The ability to harden wooden spear points by carefully charring them. Fire was transformative technology. Clothing and shelter technologies should not be underestimated either. Making good cold-weather clothing from animal hides requires numerous skills. Skinning an animal without damaging the hide. Cleaning the hide. Removing fat and tissue. Treating the hide to make it supple and prevent decay. This might involve scraping. Working in brain tissue, which contains oils and fats that help preserve the hide. Sometimes smoking the hide. Then comes cutting and sewing. Making fitted garments that provide insulation while allowing movement. Shelters needed to protect from wind, rain, snow, cold. Different regions and seasons called for different designs. Some groups built substantial semi-subterranean houses, digging into the ground for insulation and building wooden frames covered with hides and earth. Others made lighter structures, frameworks of poles covered with hides or bark, designed to be put up and taken down quickly. The engineering required to make a shelter that would withstand high winds or heavy snow was not trivial. Proportions mattered. Angle of supports mattered. How skins were lashed together mattered. This was practical architecture developed through trial and error and refined over generations. And then there were specialized tools for specific tasks. Bone needles for sewing, with eyes carefully drilled or ground through. Scrapers of different shapes for working hides. Gravers for engraving designs on bone or antler. Drills for making holes. Knives for cutting. Choppers for breaking bones to extract marrow. Hammerstones for knapping and for breaking nuts. Grinding stones for processing seeds and pigments. Containers made from hide, bark, or woven fibers. Each tool represented accumulated knowledge. Someone figured out that a scraper worked better if the edge was shaped a certain way. Someone discovered that heating stones made them easier to flake. Someone invented the outlotl by experimenting with ways to throw spears more effectively. Each innovation was tested, refined, shared, passed down. Technology built on itself, with each generation adding small improvements and adaptations. And here is something important to understand. These tools, these technologies, were not just functional objects. They were also expressions of culture and identity. A stone point was not just a weapon. Its shape, the care taken in its manufacture, the material chosen, these could all carry meaning. This point was made in the style of our people. This is how we do things. This is beautiful as well as useful. Some tools show evidence of having been made with more care than strictly necessary for function. They are symmetrical beyond what is needed. They are made from beautiful stone, chosen for its color or translucency. They show skill that goes beyond mere adequacy. This is craftsmanship. This is art. This is someone taking pride in their work, wanting to make something not just functional but excellent. In museums, you can sometimes see stone points from thousands of years ago, and even across that vast gulf of time, you can still appreciate the skill involved. The napper who made that point knew what they were doing. They took their time. They made something worth making well. And in that care, in that attention to craft, we see something profoundly human. Technology was not something separate from daily life for ancient Americans. It was woven into every aspect of existence. You could not gather food without baskets or bags. You could not hunt without weapons. You could not stay warm without clothing and shelter. You could not process materials without appropriate tools. Technology was survival, but it was also culture, craft, knowledge, and sometimes art. And all of this was done without books, without formal schools, without written instructions. All of this knowledge lived in human minds and hands, transmitted through watching and practicing, through patient teaching and active learning. Every person carried a library of practical knowledge, and every group together held far more knowledge than any single person could master. This was human culture at its most fundamental. This was how we thrived. The peopling of the Americas was not a single event. It was a process unfolding over thousands of years, involving countless decisions by countless people, each choosing to move or stay, to explore or to settle. And in that long, slow process, humans spread from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, adapting to every imaginable environment these continents offered. Think about the sheer variety of landscapes humans encountered and mastered. Frozen tundra in the Arctic, where winter darkness lasts for months and summer brings clouds of mosquitoes. Coastal rainforests in the Pacific Northwest, with enormous trees and salmon-choked rivers. Deserts in the Southwest, where water is scarce and heat intense. Grasslands of the Great Plains, stretching to the horizon. Eastern forests, thick with vegetation and rich with game. High mountains, with thin air and dramatic weather. Tropical jungles in Central and South America, hot and humid and incredibly diverse in plant and animal life. The steppes of Patagonia, windswept and cold. Every climate zone, every ecosystem, humans found a way to live there. This required adaptability that is hard to overstate. The knowledge and skills needed to survive in the Arctic are completely different from those needed in the Amazon. Yet humans managed both. How? By being flexible, observant, experimental, and good at learning. When a group moved into a new environment, they had to figure out what resources were available and how to exploit them. What plants grew there? What animals lived there? Where was water? What was the weather like through the seasons? How should we build shelter? What should we wear? Some of this knowledge could be transferred from previous environments. Fire-making skills work anywhere. Basic hunting and foraging principles apply broadly. Social organization, language, storytelling, these travel with people. But many things had to be learned anew. A plant that was edible in one region might not grow in another. An animal that was common in one place might be rare or absent elsewhere. Successful adaptation required paying attention, trying new things, learning from mistakes, and it required time. You cannot learn an environment in a season or a year. You need to see it through multiple cycles. You need to experience drought and flood, abundance and scarcity. You need to discover where certain plants grow, when they are ready to harvest, how to process them. You need to learn animal behaviors, migration patterns, denning sites. This knowledge accumulates gradually. This is probably why human expansion across the Americas was not instantaneous. It was not a case of people racing from Alaska to Chile in a few generations. Instead, it was a slow spread, with groups settling in areas and spending generations learning to live there before some subgroups moved on, carrying adapted knowledge into adjacent areas, where that knowledge gave them a head start. Along the way, populations diverged. Groups that settled in different regions adapted to different conditions, both biologically and culturally. Over thousands of years, this led to the incredible diversity of Native American peoples that existed when Europeans arrived. Hundreds of distinct groups, speaking hundreds of languages, with different technologies, different social structures, different belief systems, different art styles. But at the same time, there were connections. Trade networks spread across vast distances. Materials moved from source to source, hand to hand. Obsidian from one region might be found in sites hundreds of miles away. Shells from the ocean appear in sites far inland. Ideas traveled too. Technologies, stories, artistic motifs, all of these moved along the same networks that moved physical goods. Think about what this means. A group living in what is now Ohio might never meet people from what is now Wyoming, but materials and ideas from Wyoming could still reach them through intermediate groups. Information flowed across the continents, slowly perhaps, but steadily. This created a web of connection, a continental network of human cultures in contact with each other, influencing each other, learning from each other. Some researchers talk about the Americas before European contact as if they were sparsely populated wildernesses, but this is a misperception. Population estimates vary, but many scholars now think that the Americas before 1492 had somewhere between 50 and 100 million people, possibly more. That is a substantial population, spread across 2 continents, living in every ecological zone. In some areas, population density was very high. The Valley of Mexico supported millions. The Andes had complex civilizations with populations numbering in the millions. The Amazon basin, far from being an untouched jungle, was heavily managed by indigenous peoples who cultivated crops, created fertile soil through deliberate methods, and shaped the forest to favor useful species. Even in regions that seem less densely populated, like the Great Basin or the Arctic, people were there, living successfully, managing resources, shaping landscapes in subtle but important ways. Controlled burning of vegetation to promote new growth and attract game. Pruning trees to make them produce more nuts or fruit. Creating fish weirs and traps in rivers. Building irrigation systems. Constructing mounds and earthworks. These were not pristine wildernesses. These were cultural landscapes, shaped by human presence over thousands of years. The diversity of subsistence strategies that developed is remarkable. In the Pacific Northwest, people became specialists in salmon fishing, building elaborate weirs and traps, preserving massive amounts of fish for winter use. Their societies became complex, with social hierarchies, specialized crafts, and large permanent villages, all based on the abundance of salmon and other coastal resources. This challenged the old assumption that only agricultural societies could develop social complexity. In the Arctic, people adapted to conditions that seem almost impossible to survive. They hunted seals through their breathing holes in the ice. They hunted whales from small boats, an extraordinarily dangerous but potentially rewarding endeavor. They created sophisticated clothing from animal skins that provided insulation while remaining flexible. They built houses from snow blocks when necessary, creating temporary shelters that were surprisingly effective at retaining heat. They developed kayaks and umiaks, watercraft perfectly adapted to Arctic conditions. In the Great Basin, people became experts in the resources of a harsh desert environment. They knew every edible plant and exactly when and where to find it. They harvested pine nuts in the mountains, processing them into flour and storing them for winter. They made extensive use of rabbit drives, where large groups would coordinate to herd rabbits into nets. They moved seasonally, tracking resources across a landscape that seems barren but actually offered sufficient food for those who knew where to look. On the Great Plains, people eventually became specialized bison hunters. The bison hunts could be spectacular communal efforts, with groups driving herds toward cliffs or into corrals where they could be killed. A single successful hunt might kill dozens or even hundreds of bison, providing enormous quantities of meat. Every part of the bison was used: meat for food, hides for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, sinew for sewing, horns for containers and implements, even dung for fuel. The bison became central to plains cultures, shaping their economies. their societies, their spiritual beliefs. In the eastern woodlands, people developed mixed economies. Hunting and gathering supplemented eventually by cultivation of crops. The forests were rich with game, including deer, turkey, and small mammals. Rivers and lakes provided fish and shellfish. Nut trees like oak and hickory produced annual harvests. And in some areas, people began deliberately planting and tending crops like squash, sunflowers, and later corn. These were not full-scale agriculturalists at first, but people who blended farming with traditional foraging, a flexible strategy that spread the risk. In Mesoamerica and South America, agriculture became much more intensive. Maize was domesticated from a wild grass through generations of selection, becoming the productive crop we know today. Beans, squash, tomatoes, peppers, potatoes, manioc, cacao. The Americas gave the world an enormous number of domesticated crops, developed independently by indigenous peoples through patient observation and selective breeding. These agricultural systems eventually supported dense populations and complex civilizations. But agriculture was not universal or even always desirable. In many regions, foraging remained the primary strategy because it worked well for local conditions. Food was abundant enough that the additional labor of farming was not worth it. Mobility was valuable, allowing people to exploit scattered resources. Storage was difficult in humid environments. Risk was distributed by relying on many different resources rather than committing to a few crops. Different places called for different strategies. What is important to understand is that these were not predetermined or inevitable paths. People made choices based on their circumstances, their values, their needs. Some groups chose to settle in permanent villages. Others preferred mobile lifestyles. Some developed hierarchical societies with chiefs and social classes. Others maintained egalitarian structures. Some specialized in particular resources. Others remained generalists. Diversity was the pattern, not uniformity. And through all of this, for thousands of years, human populations grew and spread and adapted and diversified. Languages evolved and split. Belief systems developed. Rich cosmologies explaining the nature of the world. Art appeared in many forms: rock art, carved bone, woven designs, painted hides, ceramic decoration, music and dance, storytelling and ritual. All the things that make human cultures rich and distinct. By the time Europeans arrived in 1492, the Americas were fully inhabited, from north to south, from coast to coast. The people living here were not recent arrivals. They were the descendants of the first Americans, the inheritors of 15,000 years or more of continuous presence, of accumulated knowledge, of adaptation and innovation. They were home. In recent decades, a powerful new tool has revolutionized our understanding of human history. DNA analysis, the ability to read the genetic code in living cells, and sometimes even in ancient preserved tissues, has given us a window into the past that is independent of archaeology. And what DNA has revealed about the first Americans is both confirming and surprising. Let's start with the basics. DNA is the molecule that carries genetic information. It is present in every cell in your body. Half of your DNA came from your mother, half from your father. They inherited their DNA from their parents, and so on back through countless generations. Your DNA is a living archive of ancestry, carrying signals from thousands of years of human history. There are different types of DNA that are useful for studying human populations. Nuclear DNA, the DNA in the nucleus of cells, is a mix from both parents. Mitochondrial DNA, which exists in mitochondria outside the nucleus, is inherited only from mothers. Y chromosome DNA is inherited only from fathers. Each type of DNA tells us different things about ancestry and population history. When researchers first began studying the DNA of Native American populations, they found something striking. Native Americans showed genetic signatures that clearly linked them to Asian populations, but with distinctive variations that suggested a period of isolation and then diversification. This fit perfectly with the idea of migration from Asia, followed by spread and adaptation across the Americas. More detailed analysis revealed patterns that archaeologists had suspected, but could not prove. There was evidence of a single ancestral population, sometimes called the first Americans, from which all Native American groups descended. This population showed genetic signatures suggesting they had been isolated for a period of time, not mixing with other groups. This is exactly what you would expect if people lived in Beringia for thousands of years, separated from Asian populations to the west, and not yet having expanded into the Americas to the east. Then, starting around 15,000 years ago, or perhaps earlier, there's evidence of rapid population expansion and diversification. Groups split off and spread, adapting to different environments, and in the process, different lineages developed. Today, we can trace these lineages. We can see which Native American groups are more closely related to each other, and which represent more distant branches of the family tree. One of the most exciting developments has been the ability to extract and analyze ancient DNA from archaeological sites. This is technically challenging because DNA degrades over time, breaking into smaller and smaller fragments until nothing useful remains. Cold, dry conditions help preserve DNA longer. So do anaerobic conditions, like being buried in peat bogs or frozen in permafrost. Researchers have managed to extract DNA from bones and teeth thousands of years old. They have even extracted human DNA from sediments in caves, DNA shed from skin cells and hair and other tissues that accumulated in the cave floor. This ancient DNA can be sequenced and compared with DNA from living populations, allowing us to trace genetic relationships across thousands of years. What has ancient DNA revealed? Several important things. First, it confirms that the people living in the Americas 15,000 years ago were indeed the ancestors of modern Native Americans. The genetic continuity is clear. Second, it shows that different regions were settled by groups that diverged from each other relatively early. The people who settled North America and those who settled South America split from each other early in the expansion, though there was still some later contact and gene flow between regions. Third, ancient DNA has revealed some surprises. For example, one ancient individual from Alaska, known as the ancient Beringia, represents a lineage that split off very early from the main ancestral population, but apparently did not contribute significantly to later Native American populations. This suggests that the early peopling of the Americas was more complex than a simple bifurcation, with multiple lineages present, some of which persist today, and others which do not. Fourth, DNA has helped resolve some questions about relationships between ancient peoples and modern tribes. In several cases where remains have been found and controversy arose about their cultural affiliation, DNA analysis has helped establish connections to living descendant communities, supporting oral traditions and tribal claims to ancestry. But DNA also has limitations, and it is important to understand them. DNA can tell us about genetic relationships and population movements, but it cannot tell us about culture, language, beliefs, or individual lives. Two groups might be genetically very similar, but culturally distinct, speaking different languages and practicing different traditions. Conversely, groups that are genetically distinct might share cultural traits through contact and exchange. DNA also requires careful ethical handling, especially when dealing with indigenous peoples. Who has the right to sample and analyze DNA from ancient remains? Who controls the data? How should results be shared? These are not just scientific questions, but ethical and political ones. Many Native American tribes have strong feelings about disturbing ancestral remains, and researchers must work respectfully with descendant communities, following appropriate protocols and recognizing tribal sovereignty. When done right, DNA research can be a powerful complement to oral traditions and archaeological evidence. All three lines of evidence, genetics, archaeology, and oral tradition, can illuminate different aspects of history. They tell overlapping but distinct stories, and taken together, they give us the richest possible picture of the past. One of the most interesting findings from DNA research is evidence of adaptations to specific environments. As populations spread across the Americas and adapted to different climates and altitudes, natural selection acted on genetic variants that helped people survive in those conditions. For example, populations living at high altitude in the Andes show genetic adaptations that help them cope with low oxygen levels. Populations in the Arctic show adaptations related to cold tolerance and diet. These adaptations occurred relatively quickly in evolutionary terms, within a few thousand years in some cases. This tells us that humans are not finished evolving. We continue to adapt to our environments, and the timescale for some adaptations can be surprisingly short when the selective pressure is strong. DNA has also shed light on contact between different populations. There is genetic evidence of multiple waves of migration from Asia into the Americas, not just the initial settlement, but later movements as well. Some populations in the Arctic show genetic signatures of contact with populations from Eastern Asia as recently as a few thousand years ago. In South America, some groups show evidence of ancient contact with Polynesian populations, though the details and timing are still debated. And then there is the question of population size. How many people were there at different times in the past? Genetics can provide estimates based on the amount of genetic diversity present. Low diversity suggests a small population. High diversity suggests a larger one. The pattern suggests that the initial population entering the Americas was relatively small, perhaps just a few thousand people. But then population size grew rapidly as people spread and adapted. By the time of European contact, as we mentioned earlier, the total population was probably in the tens of millions. Looking at all of this genetic data, a picture emerges. The first Americans came from Asia, probably via Beringia, probably in multiple waves over thousands of years. They brought with them the genetic diversity of Asian populations, but then underwent a period of isolation and adaptation that created a distinctive Native American genetic signature. As they spread across the continents, populations diverged, adapted to local environments, and occasionally mixed with each other through migration and contact. The result is the pattern we see today, where Native American populations show clear evidence of common ancestry, but also distinctive regional characteristics. This DNA story is still being written. Every year, new samples are analyzed, new techniques are developed, new questions are asked. Ancient DNA research is a young field, only a few decades old, and it is advancing rapidly. What we know today will be refined and expanded by what we learn tomorrow. But already, DNA has done something profound. It has connected the deep past to the present in a tangible way. When we look at the genetic code of living Native Americans, we are seeing signals from 15,000 years ago and more. Genetic variants that have been passed down through countless generations, from the first Americans to the present. The past is not gone. It lives in every cell of every descendant. That is a powerful thought to carry with you as you drift towards sleep. 15,000 years is a long time. Long enough for populations to spread across 2 continents. Long enough for languages to diverge and multiply. Long enough for cultures to develop in hundreds of different directions, shaped by local environments, by chance, by choices made by countless individuals and communities. Long enough for incredible diversity to emerge. When Europeans first arrived in the Americas, they encountered not a uniform population, but a patchwork of distinct peoples. Hundreds of different tribes, nations, and confederacies. Hundreds of different languages, falling into many different language families, some so distinct that they were as different from each other as English is from Chinese. Different subsistence strategies, different technologies, different social structures, different artistic traditions, different belief systems. This diversity is important to understand because it challenges simplistic ideas about who the first Americans were. There were no Native Americans, in the singular. There were Haudenosaunee and Cherokee and Lakota and Chumash and Navajo and Aymara and Mapuche and thousands of other distinct groups, each with their own identity, their own history, their own way of being in the world. Some of this diversity was environmental. People adapted to the places they lived, and the Americas offer an extraordinary range of environments. We have already discussed some of these adaptations. Arctic peoples developing specialized cold weather technologies. Northwest coast peoples becoming expert salmon fishers. Plains peoples focusing on bison hunting. But the adaptations went deeper than just subsistence strategies. Think about social organization. In some places, people lived in small mobile bands, extended families that moved seasonally, without formal leaders or social hierarchy. These societies were fundamentally egalitarian, with decisions made by consensus, with skills and knowledge valued more than any notion of inherited status. This was common in environments where mobility was important and where resources were scattered. In other places, more complex social structures developed. Some societies had chiefs, individuals with recognized authority, and often with that authority passing down through family lines. Some had social classes, distinctions between nobles and commoners, between elites and workers. Some Northwest Coast societies developed systems where wealth and status were demonstrated through elaborate gift-giving ceremonies called potlatches, where chiefs competed for prestige by giving away or destroying valuable goods. In Mesoamerica and the Andes, complex civilizations emerged with cities, states, and empires. These were not simple societies. They had sophisticated governments, legal systems, tax collection, military forces, public works, monumental architecture, writing systems, calendar systems, complex mathematics, and astronomy. The level of social complexity and organizational capacity was comparable to any civilization in the ancient world. But complexity is not the same as advancement. This is important. A mobile hunter-gatherer society was not somehow less advanced or less sophisticated than an agricultural civilization. It was differently organized, adapted to different circumstances, with different values and priorities. From a certain perspective, the mobile lifestyle could be seen as more free, less constrained by authority and hierarchy, with more personal autonomy. From another perspective, the resources and security available in agricultural civilizations had their own appeal. Neither way of life was objectively better. They were different adaptive strategies, suited to different environments and chosen by people based on their circumstances and values. The diversity of Native American societies should be seen as a testament to human flexibility and creativity, not as a hierarchy with some groups more advanced than others. Language diversity is another remarkable aspect of Native American history. By some estimates, there were over 1,000 distinct languages spoken in the Americas before European contact. These languages fell into numerous language families, groups of related languages that descended from common ancestors. Some families include just a handful of languages. Others include dozens. The diversity suggests great time depth. Languages diversify relatively slowly. It takes thousands of years for a single language to split into many distinct descendants. The fact that there are so many unrelated or very distantly related language families in the Americas means that populations separated and spread a very long time ago, long enough for their languages to diverge beyond easy recognition of common ancestry. Each language represents a unique way of categorizing and describing the world. Languages differ in how they divide up color space, how they express time and aspect, how they indicate relationships between actors and actions, what distinctions they mark as important. A language is not just a tool for communication. It is a framework for thought, a cultural system embedded in grammar and vocabulary. When a language goes extinct, that unique perspective is lost. Today, many Native American languages are endangered, with only a few elderly speakers remaining. This is a tragedy, not just for the communities who lose their ancestral languages, but for humanity as a whole. Each language that disappears takes with it unique knowledge, unique ways of understanding, unique beauty. Language revitalization efforts are underway in many communities, working to teach languages to young people, to document and record what remains. But it is an uphill battle. Artistic traditions also varied enormously across the Americas. Northwest Coast peoples created elaborate carved and painted totems, masks, and house posts, using form-line design systems that are instantly recognizable. Plains peoples decorated hides and later cloth with geometric and representational designs, often depicting important events or spiritual visions. Southwestern pueblos created pottery with distinctive black-on-white or polychrome designs. Arctic peoples carved ivory and bone into tools and art objects. Mesoamerican civilizations created jade carvings, elaborate murals, and manuscripts painted on bark paper or deer skin. In each case, the art was not just decoration. It carried meaning, told stories, communicated identity, served spiritual functions. The designs and symbols used in art were part of a cultural language, understood by people within that culture, connecting them to their history and to each other. Religious and spiritual beliefs also showed great diversity, though some common themes recur. Most Native American belief systems emphasized relationships with the natural world, seeing animals, plants, and even geographical features as having spirit or agency. Many cultures had complex creation stories explaining the origin of the world and of their own people. Many had elaborate ritual cycles tied to the seasons or to important life events, but the specifics varied enormously. Some societies were very concerned with maintaining balance and harmony with the natural and spiritual worlds through careful adherence to rituals and taboos. Others emphasized individual spiritual experiences, vision quests, where a person sought contact with spiritual forces. Some had priesthoods and formal religious institutions. Others had shamans, individuals with special gifts for healing and mediating between the human and spirit worlds. Burial practices differed. Some groups buried their dead with elaborate grave goods, preparing them for a journey to the afterlife. Others cremated. Some created elaborate earthen mounds as burial sites. Some returned the dead to the earth with minimal ceremony. Each approach reflected different beliefs about death, the afterlife, and the relationship between the living and the dead. Gender roles and sexuality also showed variation. While many societies had some division of labor by gender, the specifics of what work was considered men's or women's varied. In some societies, women held significant political power, owned property, or had important roles in religious ceremonies. Some societies recognized more than two genders, with individuals who did not fit into male or female categories having their own recognized roles and identities, sometimes with special spiritual significance. Marriage practices varied. Some societies were monogamous, some polygamous. Some emphasized marriage within the group. Some created alliances through marriage between groups. Some had elaborate ceremonies and gift exchanges accompanying marriage. Some treated it more informally. The point is that there was no single Native American way of organizing family and kinship. There were many ways, adapted to different needs and reflecting different cultural values. This diversity was not frozen in time. Native American societies were not unchanging. They innovated, they adapted to changing circumstances. They influenced each other through contact and trade. Technology spread. Corn agriculture, which originated in Mesoamerica, gradually spread north and south, transforming societies that adopted it. The horse, introduced by Europeans but quickly adopted by many native groups, particularly on the plains, revolutionized hunting and warfare and led to the development of new cultural forms. What we should take from all this is a profound respect for human cultural diversity. The first Americans and their descendants created hundreds of different ways of being human, of organizing society, of understanding the world, of creating beauty, of giving life meaning. None of these ways was the right way or the best way. They were all valid expressions of human possibility, adapted to their specific times and places. When you encounter the term Native American or Indigenous peoples of the Americas, remember that these are umbrella terms covering extraordinary diversity. The individuals and communities who trace their ancestry back to the first Americans are not a monolith. They are members of distinct nations with distinct histories, distinct languages, distinct cultures. And while they share some common ancestry and some common experiences, particularly the traumatic experience of European colonization and its aftermath, they are not interchangeable. The diversity of Native America is a gift, a demonstration of human creativity and adaptability operating over 15,000 years. It is something to be honored and preserved, not flattened into simplistic stereotypes or romantic generalizations. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let yourself appreciate the richness of human culture, the many ways people have found to live, to thrive, to create meaning in their lives. When we think about ancient civilizations, certain names come to mind: Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, China. But the Americas had their own ancient civilizations, some of them rising and falling long before Europeans arrived, their achievements sometimes forgotten or dismissed, their stories waiting to be rediscovered by archaeologists and by the descendants of their builders. Let's talk about some of these early cultures, not the well-known ones like the Aztec or the Inca, who were still thriving when Europeans arrived, but the earlier ones, the ones that flourished thousands of years ago and then transformed or declined, leaving behind monuments and mysteries. Start with the earthworks of eastern North America. Across the Ohio River Valley and surrounding regions, ancient peoples built elaborate earthen structures. These are not natural features. They are constructions, mounds and embankments shaped by human hands, sometimes covering many acres, sometimes rising to impressive heights. The oldest of these earthworks date back thousands of years. Poverty Point in Louisiana, for example, was built around 3,500 years ago. It consists of massive earthen ridges arranged in concentric semicircles, creating a complex that covers hundreds of acres. People who built this were not farmers in the traditional sense. They were hunter-gatherers, or at least people with an economy based primarily on wild resources, supplemented by some cultivation. Yet they created monumental architecture, which challenges our assumptions about what kinds of societies can invest in such projects. Later came the Hopewell culture, flourishing around 2,000 years ago in the Ohio Valley. The Hopewell built elaborate earthworks, some geometric, some in the shapes of animals. They created extensive trade networks, bringing materials from across North America, obsidian from the Rockies, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians. These materials were worked into beautiful objects, buried in elaborate graves that suggest complex beliefs about death and the afterlife. Then came the Mississippian culture, peaking around 1,000 years ago. The Mississippians were agricultural people, growing corn, beans, and squash. They built substantial towns and cities, with large earthen mounds serving as platforms for important buildings, temples, and elite residences. The largest Mississippian center was Cahokia, located near modern St. Louis. At its peak, Cahokia might have had a population of 10 to 20,000 people, making it larger than many European cities of the same period. Cahokia had massive mounds, the largest being Monk's Mound, which rises 100 feet and covers 14 acres at its base. The city had a central plaza, residential neighborhoods, a sophisticated astronomical calendar made of wooden posts called a woodhenge, and evidence of long-distance trade and political power. This was an urban center, a complex society, a civilization by any reasonable definition. And then it declined. By the time Europeans arrived in the region, Cahokia was abandoned. The reasons for its decline are debated. Environmental degradation, perhaps, from deforestation and overhunting. Climate change making agriculture less reliable. Political upheaval or warfare. Disease. Some combination of these factors. We do not know for certain, but the city fell silent, and the knowledge of who built it was lost to later European settlers, who often assumed the mounds were natural features or built by some mysterious vanished race, rather than by the ancestors of the Native Americans still living in the region. In the Southwest, other ancient cultures were flourishing. The ancestral Puebloans, also called the Anasazi, built elaborate cliff dwellings and pueblos in the Four Corners region, starting around 1,500 years ago and peaking around 800 to 900 years ago. They created sophisticated architecture from stone and adobe, with multi-story buildings, kivas for ceremonial purposes, and impressive engineering, including roads and water management systems. Chaco Canyon in New Mexico was a major center, with large great houses that required enormous labor to build. The walls were made of carefully shaped stones, some transported from miles away. The buildings were precisely aligned with solar and lunar events. Roads, perfectly straight, radiated out from Chaco, connecting it to outlying communities. This was clearly a place of importance, probably religious and political significance, drawing people from a wide region for ceremonies and trade. Then, around 700 years ago, the ancestral Puebloans abandoned many of their settlements, including Chaco Canyon and the famous cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde. They migrated to areas with more reliable water, consolidating into the pueblos that still exist today. The descendants of the ancestral Puebloans are the modern Pueblo peoples of New Mexico and Arizona, who maintain continuous cultural traditions stretching back over 1,000 years. In Mesoamerica, the timeline of civilization is even older and more complex. The Olmec culture, which flourished from about 3,500 to 2,500 years ago, is considered the mother culture of Mesoamerica. They created massive stone heads, some weighing many tons, carved from basalt transported from distant quarries. They developed early forms of writing and the Mesoamerican ball game. They influenced later cultures, including the Maya and the Aztec. The Maya civilization is particularly remarkable. Rising around 2,000 years ago and peaking in what is called the Classic Period, roughly 1,500 to 1,100 years ago, the Maya created dozens of city-states across southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. They built magnificent stone pyramids and palaces. They developed a sophisticated writing system, one of only a few fully developed writing systems invented independently anywhere in the world. They were skilled mathematicians and astronomers, creating accurate calendars and predicting celestial events. And then many of the classic Maya cities were abandoned during what is called the Maya collapse, around 1,100 years ago. The reasons are still debated. Drought seems to have played a role, combined with warfare and political instability. But the Maya civilization did not disappear. The people migrated, reorganized, and continued their culture. Maya cities in the Yucatan flourished for centuries after the classic collapse. And today, millions of people speak Maya languages and maintain cultural traditions with deep roots in the ancient past. In South America, the story is similarly complex. The Chavan culture in Peru, around 3,000 years ago, created elaborate stone temples and developed artistic styles that influenced later cultures. The Moche, around 2,000 years ago, built large adobe pyramids and created sophisticated pottery depicting detailed scenes of daily life, ritual, and mythology. The Nazca, famous for their lines drawn in the desert, flourished around the same time. And then came the Inca, who in just a few centuries before European contact created the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas, stretching along the Andes from modern Ecuador to Chile. They built roads, suspension bridges, elaborate stone structures without mortar, agricultural terraces on mountain slopes, and a complex administrative system managing millions of people without written language, using instead a system of knotted strings called quipu. All of these civilizations rose and, in many cases, fell or transformed before Europeans arrived. They are evidence that the Americas were not a static place waiting to be discovered. They were dynamic, with cultures rising and declining, with innovations and transformations, with human societies experimenting with different ways of organizing themselves, different approaches to monumental architecture, different belief systems, different forms of art and expression. The ruins they left behind are remarkable. Even today, visiting places like Cahokia, Chaco Canyon, or Machu Picchu, you can feel the power of what was created there. The scale of ambition, the skill of construction, the vision of the planners and builders. These were not simple societies. They were complex, sophisticated, capable of organizing labor on a massive scale, capable of creating beauty as well as functionality. And we are still learning about them. Archaeology continues to reveal new sites, new information, new insights into how these societies functioned. Techniques like LiDAR, which can see through forest canopy, have revealed extensive structures in areas previously thought to be relatively uninhabited. Studies of agriculture have shown how sophisticated ancient farming techniques were, with raised fields, chinampas, irrigation systems, and soil management creating productive and sustainable food production. What happened to these civilizations? Some were conquered by other indigenous groups. Their people absorbed into new political structures. Some declined due to environmental changes or internal conflicts. Some transformed gradually, their people dispersing or reorganizing in new ways. And when Europeans arrived, many indigenous societies were still thriving, though the diseases and violence brought by colonization would devastate populations and destroy political structures. But the legacy remains. The descendants of these ancient civilizations still live in the Americas. They carry forward languages, traditions, knowledge that has roots stretching back thousands of years. And the monuments, the earthworks, the ruins, all of these stand as testament to what was achieved, to the creativity and capability of the ancient Americans who built them. As you settle into sleep, let these images rest in your mind. Stone pyramids rising above jungle canopies, earthen mounds on the Mississippi floodplain, cliff dwellings tucked into canyon walls, all evidence of human ambition and human achievement, created by the descendants of the first Americans, the people who crossed into these continents so many thousands of years ago and built entire worlds. The story of the first Americans does not end in the distant past. It continues into the present. The descendants of those first brave travelers who crossed into the Americas thousands of years ago are still here. Native American, First Nations, and indigenous peoples across North and South America are living inheritors of that deep history. This is important to understand. Sometimes when we talk about ancient peoples, we speak as if they vanished, as if they are only archaeological subjects, interesting relics of the past. But the first Americans have living descendants. The connection is unbroken. In your DNA, if you are of Native American ancestry, are genes that were carried across Beringia 15,000 years ago or more. In your culture, if you are part of an indigenous community, are traditions, stories, knowledge that have been passed down through countless generations. In your languages are words and grammatical structures that have been spoken for thousands of years. The past is not past. It is present. Of course, that continuity has been challenged and threatened. The European colonization of the Americas, beginning in 1492, brought catastrophic changes to indigenous populations. Diseases to which Native Americans had no immunity swept through communities, killing vast numbers of people. Some estimates suggest that in the first century after contact, 90% or more of the indigenous population of the Americas died from disease. 90%. This was a demographic catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. Beyond disease, there was violence, wars, massacres, forced removals from ancestral lands. There were deliberate policies aimed at destroying indigenous cultures. Children taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak their languages or practice their traditions. Sacred sites desecrated, treaties broken, land stolen, a litany of injustice stretching over 5 centuries. And yet, despite all of this, indigenous peoples and cultures persist. Languages are still spoken. Ceremonies are still performed. Traditional knowledge about plants, animals, and landscapes continues to be held and used. Political organizing and activism have won back some rights and some lands. Cultural revitalization movements are working to teach younger generations about their heritage. This resilience is remarkable. It is a testament to the strength of cultural identity, to the importance of community, to the human capacity to endure and to resist erasure. The fact that hundreds of distinct indigenous nations still exist in the Americas, with millions of people who identify as indigenous, is itself a profound success in the face of overwhelming attempts at cultural genocide. And the contributions of indigenous peoples to the wider world are often underappreciated. We have already mentioned the crops domesticated by ancient Americans: corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, vanilla, peppers, squash, beans, peanuts, and many others. These crops now feed much of the world. Can you imagine Italian food without tomatoes? Irish history without potatoes? Swiss chocolate without cacao? These foods, fundamental to cuisines around the globe, were developed by indigenous peoples of the Americas through careful selection and cultivation over thousands of years. Beyond food crops, there are medicinal plants. Quinine from cinchona bark, used to treat malaria. Coca, from which cocaine was derived and used as an anesthetic. Rubber from rubber trees. Numerous other plants with medicinal or practical uses that were known to indigenous peoples long before they entered global trade. There are technologies and techniques. Canoes, snowshoes, and kayaks were indigenous inventions. So were hammocks. The Maya invented the concept of zero in mathematics independently from other cultures. The Inca developed frost-resistant agricultural techniques at high altitude that are still studied today. Traditional ecological knowledge about sustainable resource management is increasingly recognized as valuable by conservation biologists. There are political ideas. Some scholars argue that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois League, influenced the development of democratic ideas in the United States. The Confederacy was a union of several nations with a system of representation and consensus decision-making that had existed for centuries before European contact. The idea that political systems could be organized through federation of distinct groups, with checks and balances and protection of rights, was demonstrated in practice by the Haudenosaunee. But beyond specific contributions, there is something deeper. Indigenous worldviews often emphasize balance, reciprocity, and relationship with the natural world in ways that are increasingly relevant as humanity faces environmental crises. The idea that humans are part of nature, not separate from it or above it. The idea that we have responsibilities to the land and to future generations, not just rights to exploit resources. These are not just poetic notions. They are frameworks for living sustainably, frameworks that indigenous peoples have practiced for thousands of years. Today, indigenous peoples are at the forefront of many environmental movements. They are protecting forests, defending water sources, maintaining biodiversity on their lands. Studies have shown that indigenous managed lands often have better conservation outcomes than other protected areas because the people managing them have deep knowledge of the ecosystems and a cultural commitment to stewardship. In the realm of knowledge, there is growing recognition that indigenous knowledge systems are valid ways of understanding the world, not just folklore or superstition. Ethnobotany, the study of how cultures use plants, has documented thousands of plant species used medicinally, nutritionally, or technologically by indigenous peoples. Often, scientific analysis confirms the effectiveness of these uses. Traditional ecological knowledge about animal behavior, climate patterns, and ecosystem dynamics is increasingly valued by scientists. And in the arts, indigenous creators are making powerful contributions to literature, music, visual arts, and film. They are telling their own stories, reclaiming narratives that were often told about them by outsiders. They are revitalizing artistic traditions and also creating new forms that blend traditional and contemporary elements. The political situation for indigenous peoples in the Americas varies greatly by country and region. Some indigenous nations have achieved significant degrees of self-governance. Some have won legal battles recognizing their rights to land and resources. Some have gained political representation and influence. But many still face discrimination, poverty, and marginalization. The struggle for justice and recognition continues. What is important for everyone to understand is that indigenous history is not just ancient history. It is contemporary. The people whose ancestors were the first Americans are still here, still maintaining their identities, still contributing to their communities and to the world. They are not museum exhibits or relics of the past. They are living peoples with agency, with contemporary concerns, with visions for the future. When we learn about the first Americans, we are not just learning about the past. We are learning the beginning of a story that continues today. We are connecting with histories that are still alive in the present, and we are recognizing that the relationship between indigenous peoples and the lands of the Americas is not something that ended with European colonization. It continues, it evolves, it matters. As you drift toward sleep, consider the tremendous arc of time we have traveled tonight, from the Ice Age world of 20,000 years ago, through the journeys across Beringia and down the coasts and across the continents, through the diversification of cultures and languages, through the rise of civilizations, through the catastrophe of colonization, to the present day where indigenous peoples continue to thrive and adapt and contribute. It is a story of resilience, of adaptation, of human capability and human endurance. And it is a story that deserves respect, attention, and accurate telling. The first Americans were not simple or primitive. They were fully human, complex, capable, creative. Their descendants remain so today. And all of us, whether we have indigenous ancestry or not, live in a world shaped by their presence, their innovations, their struggles, and their continued existence. We have journeyed together through 15,000 years or more. We have crossed frozen lands and sailed down unfamiliar coasts. We have stood beside megafauna that no longer exist. We have watched stone tools being made with skill and patience. We have seen diverse cultures flourish from the Arctic to Patagonia. We have recognized both the achievements and the suffering of indigenous peoples. And now, as this long night's journey draws toward its close, we can rest with what we have learned. The story of the first Americans is not a simple story. It refuses easy summary. It is complex, sometimes contradictory, often uncertain, always fascinating. We have seen how scientific understanding has changed, how old certainties gave way to new evidence, how each generation of researchers has built on the work of previous scholars while also questioning and revising. We know now that people were in the Americas earlier than we once thought. We know that they probably came multiple times, via multiple routes. We know that they adapted with remarkable speed to diverse environments. We know that they developed sophisticated technologies and complex societies. We know that they were not a single people, but hundreds of distinct groups, each with their own identity. We know that they left behind evidence in stone and bone, in the earth itself, and in their own DNA passed down through the generations. We know that their descendants are still here, maintaining connections to that deep past, while also living fully contemporary lives. We know that the story is not over, that new discoveries continue to reshape our understanding. But there are still things we do not know. We do not know exactly when the first people arrived. We do not know all the routes they used. We do not know the full extent of early population movements and interactions. We do not know what beliefs and stories animated their lives. We can infer and we can interpret, but there's much that is forever lost to time. And that is all right. History always has gaps. The past is always partially obscured. What matters is that we approach it with honesty, with respect, with willingness to revise our understanding when new evidence appears. What matters is that we recognize the humanity of ancient peoples, that we see them not as abstract historical subjects, but as real people who lived real lives. If this journey has given you anything, perhaps it is a sense of connection to the deep past. Those footprints at White Sands, pressed into mud 23,000 years ago, were made by feet like yours. Those stone tools, shaped with such care and skill, were made by hands like yours. Those children playing around ancient campfires, learning from their elders, growing up to become the next generation of knowledge holders, those were people like us, separated by time, but connected by common humanity. Perhaps this journey has given you a broader appreciation for the diversity of human cultures. The first Americans and their descendants created hundreds of ways of being human, each valid, each adapted to particular circumstances, each with its own beauty and complexity. This diversity is precious. It is evidence of human creativity operating across vast stretches of time and space. Perhaps this journey has given you a deeper respect for indigenous peoples today, knowing that they are the inheritors of 15,000 years of continuous presence in the Americas, knowing the knowledge they carry, knowing the resilience they have shown. This should inspire respect and support for indigenous rights and sovereignty. Or perhaps, if you have just been listening as you fall asleep, this journey has simply given you rest. That is fine too. That is part of why we tell stories like this, in this way. Sometimes we need information delivered gently, without urgency, allowing us to drift in and out of attention. Sometimes the best way to learn is to relax and let the words wash over us, retaining what resonates and releasing the rest. Whatever you take from this journey, know that the story of the first Americans is your story too. In some sense, even if you have no indigenous ancestry, you live in a world shaped by what those first brave travelers set in motion. You eat foods they domesticated. You use words they coined. You live on lands they knew first. Their history is part of human history, and human history belongs to all of us, to learn from and to honor. The sun is rising now in this story, a new dawn after a long night of travel through time. The light touches ancient landscapes that are still here, changed but recognizable. Rivers still flow through valleys they carved. Mountains still stand where they stood. And people still live here, descendants of the first Americans, carrying forward traditions, adapting to new circumstances, looking toward the future while honoring the past. If you are still awake, hearing these words, then thank you for staying with this journey. I hope it has been worthwhile. I hope you have learned something, or had something you knew confirmed, or had something you thought you knew challenged. I hope the complexity and the uncertainty of the story have not frustrated you, but instead intrigued you. This is how history actually is, not neat and simple, but messy and fascinating. If this journey has resonated with you, perhaps you might share it with someone else who seeks rest and learning together. Perhaps you might leave a comment about where you are listening from, what part of the world you call home, whether that place has its own deep history waiting to be understood. Perhaps you might explore more about the indigenous peoples whose land you live on, learning their names, their histories, their present circumstances. But for now, you need do nothing at all. You can simply rest. Let the weight of 15,000 years settle around you like a blanket. Let the story fade as sleep takes over. Let your breathing deepen and slow. Let yourself drift into dreams, where perhaps you walk ancient paths, where you see landscapes as they were, where you glimpse lives lived long ago, but somehow still present. The first Americans walked a long road. They crossed lands that no longer exist. They adapted to environments that have transformed. They created cultures that flowered and sometimes faded. They passed down knowledge through countless generations. They survived catastrophe. They persist into the present. Their journey continues. And you, listener, wherever you are in time and space as you hear these words, you are part of the continuing human story. You are another point on the long arc of history that stretches from those first footsteps in the Americas to this present moment. You carry forward the legacy of human curiosity, human resilience, human creativity. May you rest well. May your dreams be peaceful. May you wake refreshed. And may you carry forward, in whatever small way, the spirit of those first Americans who looked at an unknown land and kept walking forward, into mystery, into possibility, into the future that became the present we inherit. Thank you for this journey. Good night.